listeners, I'm Sam with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of the Below the Radar B-Sides, we're joined by Johan Grimonprez, a Belgian multimedia artist, filmmaker and curator whose film Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat was nominated for the Oscar for Best Documentary at the 97th Academy Awards. Am and Johan discuss Johan's past video work and what Johan discovered along the way in creating and sharing Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar, or what might be an alternative name by the time this podcast comes out. We are here with our special guest this week. Johan Grimonprez is with us. Welcome, Johan.
Hello, I'm pleased to be there. Thanks for offering the platform, and I hope you can hold the platform as long as you can.
Yeah, Johan, maybe we can begin with you introducing yourself a little bit.
Yeah, I'm a filmmaker, but I often expand it to storytelling because I'm as much curator or visual artist or teacher or curator. In the past 30, 40 years, made a couple of films, one that sort of made a big splash. So yeah, basically storyteller, making films, curator, also visual artist, sort of in situ intervention sometimes. But also the teaching as a practice is a big part of how I come to make my works, make the research, confront it. And then sometimes turn that inside out as part of an exhibition where, you know, it's like my brain turned outside as sort of an iPad, a lifestyle installation, an iPad that makes the thinking visible. And so I include the research. So vlogs, not blogs, but vlogs, video research that I actually have compiled. And there's several ones. One is sort of on radical ecology and tender gardening, or maybe the sky is really green and we're just colorblind. Or the latest one, All Memory is Theft. And all of these are now going to be part of an exhibition in a retrospective at the Centrum for Kunst en Medien in Karlsruhe. And so just to say that actually teaching, because all these vlogs I used to teach, that teaching is very much part of the practice as well. Or podcasts like this, or, you know, for me, it's all part of the practice. Because a film at one point drifts above the water as an iceberg, and it's the tip of an iceberg. But for me, the work is never finished underneath. There's so much sort of rhizomatic sort of multiplications about certain themes that sort of just a moment, right? But of course, that moment is more visible in the world and gets more sort of distributed out there.
So I recently, or I guess it was a few months back, saw Soundtrack to Coup d'etat at the Vancouver International Film Festival back in late September, early October, as the full audience at the Vancouver Playhouse, and just a mesmerizing film. The audience loved it and gave it a standing ovation at the end as well. But before we jump into that work, I wanted to, since we base it out of an art school ourselves at SFU, it'd be just interesting to hear about your own sort of training in work early as a university student in terms of finding your own practice, how you came into your practice.
Oh, okay. I was shopping a bit around. I was in film departments, photography departments, but I was as well part of the university in Ghent studying what at the time was called cultural anthropology. And it was sort of more the Bourdieu school, you know, the post-structural school. But, and for me already from then onwards, to me, it was like, you know, even if I endeavored in the first film that I had to do with sort of cultural anthropology, it was more of an anthropology of anthropology, where it dissected that anthropology is so much more a stepchild of colonialism. So the discourse about the film is sometimes as much as important to dig in as much as the visual exploration. And so I set forth, we're talking mid-80s, I was actually spending some time on the border between Papua New Guinea and Irian Jaya, which is West Papua. But I stumbled onto sort of the OPM, the Operatie Papua Merdeka, and they're a guerrilla group. And I just sort of finished school, and I was thrown out there, and suddenly being a 24-year-old sort of out there trying to sort of explore my practice, that actually was a game changer. Because for the first time I was sort of, you know, Belgium is very sheltered, and we can talk about that as well in relation to the Belgian Congo and to its colonial sort of past. But for me, it was a game changer because I suddenly was in confrontation with people that told me, my mom has been killed, my brother's been killed, the Transmigration project that actually are sponsored by the World Bank are partially responsible for that. But it goes back to what happened mid-60s in Indonesia with Sukarno being overthrown and then Suharto being installed by the CIA, et cetera, et cetera. But I was there in 1986 and villages were being napalmed around Freeport copper mine. And I learned this through Amnesty International. And so all of that was for me a big game changer that really defined how my film practice would sort of be explored and researched later on. So we're talking mid 80s. I was just, a student. And then following up on that, I took on courses in New York, studied at School of Visual Arts, and film was part of that. And so this experience in Irian Jaya, but we should call also West Papua, because there's still a secessionist war going on, but those West Papuans are outnumbered by transmigration projects of poor Javanese families. So there's a lot of tension there still today, knowing that 1 million profit is coming out of Freeport copper mine, which is $1 million of profit. And so nothing sort of poured back to the local population. But anyway, that as a theme became important for my first sort of film, Cowboying or Where's Your Helicopter, dealing immediately with sort of that decolonization movement or rethinking about sort of the periphery and what sort of, where do I come from? Where do I stand? How do we define our world and stuff?
You've also had some involvement with Documenta as well, right?
Yeah, that was, again, I was invited because of a vlog. The vlog was called Beware in Playing the Phantom, You Become One. Prends garde à jouer un fantôme, on le devient. So it was an allusion to media, but also Michel Léry's sort of quote, which is sort of about the phantom, but it's also about decolonization. But at the time, we took it on as sort of a quote that deals with media. And this vlog was very much a media archeology that dissected several themes. It was, for example, dissecting science fiction in relation to ethnographic films and exploring the imaginary other. Or there would be family rituals, which would delve into sort of nuclear family and questioning that, gender fluidity. Or there would be, for example, a couple of sections on dissecting what is sort of terrorism. As Howard Zinn says, war is terrorism with a bigger budget. So we would question very much the notion of what is terrorism. And that was the initial invitation by Catherine David for Documenta 10. And then on the side, I was getting a budget, but I was already working also on a diptych that was in Centre Pompidou. I was invited to make a new project, but also the video library, the vlog would be installed as well there. And Catherine David said, why don't we show also Dial History? But Dial History was still in the make. And then when it opened and premiered at Centre Pompidou and Documenta 10, it became sort of a big splash. And it overshadowed the video library, the vlog, which at the time was still VHS, right? And the idea was you come, it was at the Kulturbahnhof, which was the local television. And we had specifically chosen that coffee would be part of it. You take sofa, and then you take a remote control and you ask for a VHS tape, and then you plug in your own, you put in your own VHS tape. You could fast forward and rewind and take another one if you don't like it. So you were becoming a bit your own curator. But it also arrested sort of the consumption mode of when guides were taking people on the Documenta tour. They always ended up there because you could get a coffee and rest and sit, and then at your ease, sort of watch whatever you sort of as your own, as being the curator, watch whatever you would please to watch. But in the press, everything was about Dial History, and the film then came out as well. It was a huge splash. So then Dial History I crossed over to television because Arte invited it to also be acquired for Arte Television. But Dial History, which is a film about the history of airplane hijacking, but in relation to, a very short history of present-day media. It's a media archaeology also of media, and that's set against a narration taken from Don DeLillo's book Mao 2, where a terrorist and a novelist are having a conversation, and the novelist contends that, while the terrorist has maybe taken over my role because she's able to play the media much better than I am. And it's that role of sort of, again, questioning terrorism, but the cultural factor of the narration being built by a writer and the cultural factor as a filmmaker, because for me it's also autobiographical. As a filmmaker, how much can you still add to a world that is sort of full of images. We're being bombarded with images. And so as a filmmaker, where do you stand? Even not only when it comes to media culture, but where do you stand as a filmmaker when you have, political agency, the access to the political sort of debate? For me, was a crucial question as well, in relation to the writer as well. These are complex questions, but it was all present in Dahl history.
I have an obscure question to ask you, because one of the things that our office and you have in common is that we've both interviewed Michael Hart on love.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah, wondering if you can talk. We interviewed him for our podcast. He came to Vancouver to speak about his 70s book. But when he went back home, I approached him to write about love, because I'd been working on a book on friendship and community through the work of Jean-Luc Nancy with my collaborator, Matt. So I reached out to him because if you're talking about friendship and community, notions of love and solidarity come to the forefront. And as I had seen Michael give a talk, I think in Banff, and he'd been at the European Graduate School giving some seminars. So I went back, they were on YouTube, and they're 10 or 15 years ago. It was interesting. He was talking about how, he didn't end up writing a book on love because people were telling him he was being too Italian, and, some of the stuff was too theological or something like that. But it was interesting to go back to speak to him about these lectures from many years ago. So that was our route into that conversation. We did a small book, actually an edited version of that podcast interview, but wondering if you can share a little bit how your documentary came to be with Michael.
Well, at the time we were working at Shadow World, which is based on the book by Andrew Feinstein, which is an exploration in the global arms trade, actually the corruption in the global arms trade. But that's completely a pleonasm. It's actually the one and the same thing, as Andrew Feinstein says, that there's no arms deal that doesn't have a component of corruption. But we interviewed Michael Hart for that film, and I think it was 2013, 2014, somewhere. And then some of his interview ended up in the bigger film, the feature film Shadow World, which was then aired on PBS and ITVS. But I thought the interview was sort of more interesting, and then we made a separate addendum or a short film called Everyday Words Disappear, with that longer interview of Michael Hart, and then spliced with Alphaville. But why Alphaville? So, of course, the notions of the politics of love that Michael Hart talks about, right? And so he ends the book Multitude with the word love. The very last word in the book Multitude is love. So it announces commonwealth. It announces his research into the commons. But I think he calls it the common. He wants to historically make it different and sort of make a distinction. Because very often there's also confusion. Common sounds like communism, but it's not. Common means actually together, right? Community, etc. So that's where the of common comes from. And in that little film, he sort of expands on these notions of the politics of love, refers to Spinoza, where sort of the sense of joy in a community is sort of the barometer of that political agency. And then he refers also to the work on the common. But there is he starts, first of all, with referring to The Prince, Machiavelli, right, by Machiavelli. And The Prince, where there's two choices set forward: should we rule by love or by fear? And that's the portion that we also included in Shadow World. So to, again, sort of, if we critique what's wrong with the world, and the big elephant in this world is actually, for me, also it's the banking and also the defense. You shouldn't call it defense industry. It should be called war industry, because very much they're defining also foreign policy. But this is another discussion we can have later on. But he postulates that sort of choice between love and fear. And fear is actually held within the ruler, because then he can control the masses. But the love is actually held by the community and decides if they're going to go with the ruler or not. And so Machiavelli's suggestion to the prince is that if you want to keep in power and control the masses, you better go with fear. But, asks Michael Hart, what if we actually would define our choices based on community and hence love? And I think it's a very important question. But, you have to know love is a huge abstract notion. And Christine Burland, who actually was on stage with Michael Hart several times, she's a Chicago scholar. Christina Burland, who also writes about love, she says, maybe there is some trouble also because love is such a huge subject, and it's very abstract. Can it actually held all the sort of the practicalities of what politics is all about? That's one. But also you have the intimate sphere, and as Hannah Arendt says, if you marry love and politics, you get into fascism. And so there's the danger where you subject a sort of an intimate sphere to politics, and there's a danger, there's a contention that might actually be problematic. And so, but also love and passion can actually turn in its opposite. And he warns about that as well, Michael Hart. He says, love can also be the wrong love of love for the country, or love for the fundamental cause, or love for the same. And he says, but, love of difference may be more important. But there is a contingent where the love as an abstract notion doesn't cover all the sort of the concrete sort of solutions of what common would be, right? And the common and subjectivity, well, that's something else. But the common is very much rooted in community, where the decisions are being made about a resource that is shared by the community, right? And subjectivity, the agency of the subject, is defined through actually being partaking in that community. But that, for me, I always wanted to have that little film by Michael Hart on the politics of love, Everyday Words Disappear, in dialogue with Christine Berland. And so what we did then, we chose Alphaville, but still Alphaville is made in 1965 by Jean-Luc Godard. And it's a society where everything about sort of articulation about love and affection and tenderness is being sort of banned at the threat of death, right? And I think when Michael Hart was talking about how we have to define the notion of community or love, but in essence community, that we actually miss the concept, or that a lot have been atrophied when it comes to how we have defined community in relation to the common. For example, agriculture was always done in community, and it was in relationship with the forest. And the forest was part of how architecture and the building and shelter came about. And so there was always a dialogue, interspecies dialogue with the forest. Or agriculture was done, seeding and harvesting was done together. Now people say, we have a garden community here in Greece, and people say, it's such a hard labor. But we forget that actually 300, 400 years ago, there was a whole different sense of how one would define not sort of everything that is important according to community and value of economics, and everything has been reduced to values of economics. Anyway, big notions again, to come back to your question.
Totally. Yeah. Well, let's come back then to soundtrack to a coup d'etat, which, as I understand, speaking to just before the interview, will be on the screens in Canada soon, or right now, basically. But wondering, once again, I saw it at the Vancouver International Film Festival. Wonderful film, and just entranced with the concept, the way that it was made, your film in visual and in musical techniques and editing. But let's maybe, if you could start with just how you came up with the concept to start the film, first of all.
Okay. Yeah, well, indeed, it's I think it's released yesterday or today or something, because I'm going to have to follow up with some interviews as well with the national broadcast as well. But coming back and actually expanding a bit on what we just talked about Michael Hart and the common, for me, you have in the title soundtrack to a coup d'etat. So you have the musical element and you have the political element. And so while in the film, what's zoomed in on is, for me, if politics was all about divide and conquer, then the music was about making community, about bringing people together, in a nutshell, because it's literally called soundtrack to a coup d'etat. And the music is many faceted, right? Because, it was at a point where mid-60s, Louis Armstrong is being sent as a jazz ambassador to the Congo, but is used as a decoy to hide that actually the CIA, together with my country, Belgium, because they were labeling Patrice Lumumba a communist, but that was a way to get the Americans on their side, to get the United States on their side, sort of, and plotting to overthrow the first democratically elected government by the premier Patrice Lumumba, and even assassinating him. And that was in the make while Louis Armstrong arrived in the Congo. So again, you have the black jazz ambassadors, in a very schizophrenic way, had to defend democracy, while back at home segregation was still law of the land. They could not vote and were second-rate citizens. In the meantime, they had to sort of represent democracy. which sort of was already very hypocritical. But underneath also there was a plot happening. It was very similar with Digi Gillespie as a jazz ambassador sent to Syria in 1956. Operation Straggle is already being plotted by the CIA underneath, where they are buying up the Syrian government. And there's Dizzy playing, unbeknownst, because they're not in the know of the secret machinations underneath, but he's been sent out to Syria. Similar with Dave Brubeck. Dave Brubeck was in Syria in 1958, and he was literally, his tour was being prolonged by the brother of Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, Foster Dulles, who was then Secretary of State. You have the Dulles brothers, right? And so he literally prolonged that jazz tour in the Middle East because he was afraid of the Pan-Arab movement, where Abdel Nasser, then leader of Egypt, was joining with Syria as one country in the United Arab Republic. And the State Department was freaking out. And so the jazz ambassadors were being used as sort of chess pieces in a global political game. Again, hence that allusion to soundtrack to Coup d'etat. That does not mean that actually those black jazz ambassadors were passive instruments, right? So Dizzy, even in a quote in the film is that I didn't go out there to sugarcoat segregation back home. They were very much aware. So when they were briefed by the State Department, he said, I've been briefed 300 years, alluding to, of course, the situation, the transatlantic passage to the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And even Louis Armstrong, he refused during his jazz tour in Africa to play for an apartheid audience in South Africa. Or he would grill Moshe Chombi, the then sort of secessionist leader that was propped up by the mining industry, Union Minière, the Belgian company, that was trying to sort of break apart the Congo, Lumumba's Congo. And Moshe Chombi hosted Louis Armstrong, and Louis Armstrong was very much grilling Moshe Chombi while he's sitting in front of the then leader, the CIA chief, Larry Devlin, but he was not labeled a CIA chief. That was undercover. But he's sitting there and grilling Moshe Chombi, saying, "You're in bed with big money," alluding to Union Minière. And so it's not that because they're sent out as jazz ambassadors that they were passive instruments. They were sort of course, things that did not know that sort of the CIA were plotting to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, and that literally at that moment Mobutu arrives also, Joseph Mobutu, arrives in Katanga as well. And it's the moment where Larry Devlin is concocting with Moshe Chombi to arrange against payment together with the Belgians, because the Belgian Secret Service is also present during that dinner where Louis Armstrong is present. And so you see all that clash, but for Louis Armstrong, he was not in the know that actually that was being plotted under his nose. We have the interview with Trummy Trombone alluding to that as well, saying, we were all siding with Lumumba. If he had known, he would have been very upset. And he was upset when he came home, when he learned about Abby Lincoln and Max Roach crashing the Security Council in protest for the murder of Patrice Lumumba, which was announced by Adlai Stevenson, the then U.S. representative to the United Nations. I'm going off in all tangents, right? But
no, this is great. This is great because I think the film is just aesthetically and sensually so rich and so unique. I see the term cine-collage used, and just the sheer volume of archival footage, interviews, texts, footnotes, jazz soundtracks, ways to convey the paranoid style of American politics, all of those pieces that get put together into a kind of virtuoso jazz performance in the background. It's an incredible feat of work. Like, can you speak a little bit to the actual mechanics of editing and pulling a film like this together?
There's many facets and it's many layered. So there's a vertical building and a horizontal building. But first of all, the layers, I chose for a kaleidoscopic approach because as a Belgian, I was very cautious. There's a difference between speaking for and speaking with. And so I was very, very cautious for appropriation. And so immediately I invited a couple of narrators to be part of the film and to go in dialogue with. So there's a kaleidoscopic approach where we introduce André Blouin, who was a Pan-Africanist freedom fighter, and she became the chief of protocol and speechwriter for Patrice Lumumba, but also started a women's movement in the Kwilu province, which tipped, I'm convinced that she tipped actually the voting towards sort of the majority, not necessarily Lumumba's national party, but also the party of Pierre Mulele and Antoine Gizenga in the Kwilu province, which was the PSA, which then made an alliance with Patrice Lumumba to actually have the majority, even if the Belgians refused to acknowledge it. But André Blouin was very important in that situation, although women could not vote and could not be part of the government. I'm sure if that would have been the situation, André Blouin would have been part of Lumumba's government. But she became chief of protocol and speechwriter, and she, I think, in the 2 months and a half reign that Patrice Lumumba was premier, we tried to sort of shed a light through her eyes and through her perspective and through her memoirs. And we got in touch with Yves Blouin, her daughter, which actually she just republished the book. It was out of print. You could hardly find it. It was going for a lot of money on the internet. And it was published in the 1980s. And it's for the first time it's out there again in French and in English. And so I think it's a week and a half ago or a week ago that it was in England sort of gone to press and in the bookstores. But we got in touch with Yves Blouin, who agreed that we could use, there's only, I think, 3 or 4 or 5 chapters that deal with the Congo. But still, it's crucial and important enough to shed a light how, for example, Patrice Lumumba was put on a death list, as well as André Blouin by the Belgians and the CIA. Not only that, for example, Yves Blouin sent us an undeveloped roll of film, and the home movies of herself as a 2-year-old daughter being with her mom in the Congo were such wonderful images that we immediately decided, that should be part of it. And so this is just one narrative voice, right, which is read by, it's read by Mama Maridon, who's a Belgio-Congolese singer, and her dad was actually killed in the east province of the Congo. But there's a similarity between her life and that of André Blouin. So we invited Mama also to be part of it and read the memoirs. But what I think is interesting, how those intimate home movies clash with the bigger political picture. And it's very similar to Nkoli Jean Bofane, who we invited to read a part of his book, Congo Inc. And Congo Inc., the algorithm Congolese, which is about how every basically conflict mineral that was sourced for world wars in the 20th century were sourced from the Congo, but actually never made it back as sort of benefiting the population, the general population. I think an interesting take of his that he takes it all the way up to war and space and talking about coltan and lithium. And we actually, with his story, we went in an interview as well to take it all the way to the situation up today in the East Congo. But this is Nkoli Jean Bofane, but also he actually gave us access to home movies. And those home movies have a peculiar story because he and his mom were actually kidnapped when he was still a young kid by his stepdad, who was a Belgian rubber baron, and forced him to marry his mom. And then that became his stepdad. He had half sisters, half brothers, but he happened to have a movie camera. And Nkoli Jean Bofane allowed us to sort of also have a look at all those home movies. And that is a big part of all that intimate, him as a kid, a 6-year-old kid during independence, or him in Belgium, or the displacement even. The displacement of being sort of taken to Belgium, all of that in the home movies. Again, you have that clash between something very intimate and a bigger political picture. But he sheds a light from his perspective as a Congolese writer that I think was so crucial to also include. Then another third character is Nikita Khrushchev. And then we got in touch with Sergei Khrushchev, who also had a movie camera, and he was shooting his dad. Nikita Khrushchev also gave his dad, when he was actually overthrown in 1964, and Brezhnev takes power, and he's actually written out of Soviet history. Not a lot of people in the United States or in the Americas know the peculiarities of Nikita Khrushchev's character. He was written out of Soviet history in 1964, and then with the cassette recorder that he got from Sergei Khrushchev, he sort of memorized his own history, his own life, and that whole period, and that we got access to actually to tell the story. Not to make him too a saint. I think it's sort of interesting to tell the story from the point of view of a villain, right? Sort of the bad character he was demonized in the 60s. Although I have to say, we talk about decolonization. He will propose a decolonization resolution to get the Global South on his case in the 15th General Assembly, which is a big part of the film. But he also was colonizing the East Bloc. So Hungarians are still very upset with this Nikita Khrushchev character. Although in his memoirs, he would sort of offer regret. And the film starts with some of those lines saying, oh, when you make a misstep, history will not forgive you, and it will haunt you forever. The memory will haunt you forever. And we see images of the Budapest smashing down of the revolution in the 50s. And so Nikita's Khrushchev entry is very interesting because for me, you have, of course, the history of my country in relation to the Belgian Congo and how that was a neo-colonial grab in essence. This was not like that whole independence movement was quite crucial as a pivotal point, end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. 16 African countries will be admitted to the United Nations General Assembly. And it's where Nikita Khrushchev gives a call to invite all world leaders to the 15th General Assembly. And like exploring that, I felt, oh my God, this whole 15th General Assembly is so crucial because it's the first time the decolonization resolution will be proposed. But it's the first time all world leaders, and more precisely, the non-aligned leaders, such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Abdel Nasser, Sukarno, Fidel Castro gives his maiden speech at the United Nations. We have Kwame Nkrumah. 16 African countries are admitted. So the 15th General Assembly is quite important, and the Congo crisis will be the topic of that 15th General Assembly. So I could not make that in sort of the general structure of the film. And each time those intimate stories go back and are hung up on that bigger picture of the 15th General Assembly, which is also the world stage in essence, which at one point it will be deviated because Fidel Castro is thrown out of his hotel, and then he takes, upon invitation of Malcolm X, lodging in the Teresa Hotel in Harlem. And so an alternative sort of non-aligned top happens by coincidence, sort of also spontaneously in Harlem around Hotel Teresa, which is opposite Louis Michaud's bookstore on the 25th Street and 7th Avenue. And so the clash between that story of the Congo in relation to the world politics was for me quite crucial to tell. It's a story that's never been told. That sort of what was going on in the 15th General Assembly in relation to how my country was sort of using the assassination of Patrice Lumumba as the ground zero, as a neo-colonial grab to sort of how they would deal with this decolonization, and how America and the CIA the United States became an ally in this sort of neo-colonial grab. There's, of course, another fourth narrative voice, which is Conor Bruce O'Brien. He's the Irish representative who became the special representative to the Congo mission in 1961. But what I thought was interesting when I read his book, To Katanga and Back, is that he talks and opens up his whole sort of personal testimony of the genocide in Katanga, and then up also to the genocide in 1964. And that was actually quite crucial also to actually also add, by way, his son, Patrick Bruce O'Brien, is actually reading his dad's voice. And so you have all these different entries, not to forget that there's a fifth protagonist, which is the music.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the kind of characters in the film, including this sort of what would be a kind of mercenary backroom players that participate in these coups d'etats, or they set the stage for these. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to those characters that don't end up having a name or in public, but have the story behind what's being planned in these places.
Well, in essence, the dirty job was done by the mercenaries. They were hired by the Belgians, right? And specifically, Mad Mike Houari, I think Irish, South African. There's a lot of South Africans that were hired actually, but because South Africa was still sort of held in that apartheid state, and that was very much from the British Empire. And Mandela only came to power, in the 90s. So the apartheid state was prolonged for a long time. But a lot of those mercenaries, even when it comes to the liberation struggle in Rhodesia, Mad Mike was fighting there. They were hired in the 70s as well. When we talk about, when Fidel Castro sending troops to Angola, in Angola, Mad Mike I think at one point he was there, but mercenaries were also hired in that struggle. And so it was a way of how the West was dealing with this independence movement to actually still held everything in check. And it was not dissimilar in the Belgian Congo. When so-called Mobutu was installed, the kleptocracy of Mobutu, with the help of the Belgians and the CIA, he was really propped up. Then they had to smash down the Lumumbist rebellion, and 2/3 of the country was about to be sort of retaken by the Lumumbist rebels, right? And so there was this sort of notion that, oh shit, we're going to lose the country. So Mobutu had to smash down, with the help of the mercenaries, this whole Lumumbist rebellion, and that became very severe. And then, of course, action reaction becomes very sad situation. It became a genocide, basically. And then at one point, 1964, they were already actually deployed end of the 60s in North Katanga. Sendwe and Chombe, there was sort of the Balubas and Moshi Chombe, who was propped up by Belgians. There was even a rift within Katanga. And so there was sort of a civil war between North and South Katanga. South Katanga, where Lumumbashi, Elizabethville, was where Moshi Chombe was propped up as a president. But even there, with the help even of the United Nations at the time, they were closing their eyes. They smashed down, with the help of mercenaries, the Baluba rebellion. We're talking 1960 even, and Lumumba is still alive. And then that was subsequently repeated in 1964 when they tried to free Kisangani. Kisangani was sort of Stalinville at the time, was the headquarters for a part, the headquarters of the Lumumbist rebellion. And that had to be reconquered. And so they hired 800 mercenaries. But they also had the Belgian commandos. And that's ludicrous because there's still a celebration every year in Belgium. Some of those dinosaurs are still alive. Some of the mercenaries are still alive, who are very critical. They give a lot of criticism on the film. It's not accurate, this and that and that. When Malcolm X says, "Oh yeah, we have to free the white hostages," he says, there's a whole racist tone in the fact that we have to free the white hostages. But nobody talks in the press in Belgium about the bigger situation, that actually a country was sort of reconquered in essence, and then mercenaries were part of that. There's documents that I found that are so hard to listen to, and some of them we even cut out, but there's a harsh one with a South African mercenary who literally, says, while they're cannibals, we can just shoot them, So there's blatant racism, like drips from what is being said there, even including our prime minister at the time. If you look in retrospect, what they said on national television, it's sort of embarrassing. But it was the talk of the day, even Eisenhower and Nixon were joking about, in Africa, they're still like coming out of the trees, like racist statements like that happened during the NSA meetings. And I didn't put it in the film, but I stumbled upon all these things. It was...
Yeah, you described the music in the film as a kind of protagonist, and it's wonderful to see these figures coming to the Congo and seeing the context in which they're brought in as a kind of cultural diplomacy, which, today cultural diplomacy still happens on a big scale as well in different types of ways, I suppose. Certainly the French are known for it, but wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you approached the use of music in the film, because obviously it's a driving force of the narrative that brings together the collage and the editing and the different parts of the story in a kind of non-linear way.
Right. And it's also researching that period that I felt like it's not just an illustration, it's not just a soundtrack. It was very much soundtrack to a coup d'etat. I felt the music was very much also a political agent, a historical agent, and so much part of that pivotal moment, but also a political agent. And, just because I was just thinking about Marie Doon's Mama, who is reading the memoirs of André Blouin, when she actually came over to she actually read it in the kitchen in our studio. She just got back from the City of Joy. The City of Joy is in Kivu, close to the Panzi Hospital, where Dennis Mukwege is actually operating on all these raped women, right? He got the Peace Prize for that and is very outspoken in the United Nations as well. But there is the City of Joy is where all these raped women are banding together, and by way of overcoming their trauma, they actually use theater and music. And Marie Doon was giving a workshop there at the time, and it's just to allude to the fact that actually music can actually turn trauma into activism. And that's what happens in the City of Joy. And hence it's also called Joy. It's not called City of Trauma. It's called the City of Joy. And a big part of what's happening as activism in the Congo today is actually rooted for a big part of women coming out of City of Joy, for example. When it comes to what's going on, even with the conflict minerals and rape as being still used as a tool of war in East Congo. Even today, 1 in 10 women is being raped. But we were talking about the music, and hence also for me, sort of hearing that this city is called City of Joy, it's sort of thinking about how we would construct a film. It became part of that. When Patrice Lumumba is released from prison and 25th of January 1960 he arrives in Brussels for the round table, where they claim a couple of days later independence, set for 30th of June 1960. He's accompanied by the rumba musicians, Joseph Kabasele and Dr. Nico, African jazz. And on the spot in the Plaza Hotel in Brussels, they compose Independence Cha-Cha. And you see, like, music is not very far from the political stage, because they actually gave words to that joy and to that claim of agency of how independence was claimed. Even when Patrice Lumumba set up as still being a sales agent, when he was advocating for independence in the Cité and went from bar to bar, he hired Rocco Mambo, and Rocco Mambo became also a mouthpiece for claiming and talking about independence throughout the Cité. But even the history of rumba, and I know I now talk a bit about rumba, but jazz is a big part of that as well. But the rumba inherently has an interesting history as well, where the transatlantic passage to Cuba, actually, there's a huge Congolese community, a third, fourth generation, that actually inspired the whole music scene in Cuba, that led to the cha-cha, and then came back by way of the rumba by guitarists, Congolese guitarists that worked in the trade of ships between Havana and Leopoldville, and actually sourced and initiated the rumba back in the Congo. But it's interesting that Pan-African link is also part of the rumba. It's not just the jazz. Abbey Lincoln, for example, with that protest in the Security Council, which for a lot of academics launched the Black Militant movement, lived for a long time in Accra, in Kwame Nkrumah's first independent leadership. And she was part of that with Maya Angelou. And you see there's a Pan-Africanist sort of connection as well. The cha-cha then, the Independence cha-cha, also became an inspiration, because it was very popular throughout the continent of Africa, but even became literally the name for the liberation movement in Rhodesia, across the border from the Congo. It was the Liberation Party in Rhodesia at the time. And again, it's inspired on the music. And then when it comes to sort of how the film is bookended, it's Max Roach opening drum salvo that opens the film, and it ends with the scream of Abbey Lincoln. That scream happens in the Security Council, which was a protest organized by the Harlem's Writers Coalition, Women's Writer Coalition, of which Abbey Lincoln was part, and together with Rosa Guy and Maya Angelou, they, at the corner of 125th and 7th Avenue, invited by Louis Michaud and his bookstore, they were soliciting women to come and join the protest mid-February 1961. But you see here, it's musicians that initiate that protest, and specifically Abbey Lincoln. And Max Roach was there. This is not in the film, we had to cut it out, but Paul Robeson was also part of that protest in the Security Council, when all the women stand up, and he's part of that. Or Amiri Baraka, for example. The musicians were very much part of that protest. But also how the music sort of, the independence sort of movement really inspired also the civil rights movement. There was a crossover there as well. And jazz was also a part of that. Jazz was a part of that. And so if you think about the song Johannesburg, which is the protest by women who tear up their apartheid passport in South African apartheid state, and that led to the Sharpeville massacre. That was the inspiration for Tears for Johannesburg, which became part of We Insist Freedom Now album, which is very much a political album. And I have to say, while working through the film, we found a performance where We Insist Freedom Now was in its entirety broadcast on Belgian television in 1964. And the images that you see are actually on Belgian television. And I could not but sort of also include that in the film. But there's a deeper also connection to that concert on the Belgian television, because I often say, we have that relationship with jazz in Belgium, which is maybe a bit different than when still in the United States the civil rights movement was going on, and jazz had a different sort of connotation in Belgium. It was perceived differently, and you have all these jazz buffs in awe with sort of this album We Insist Freedom Now that was performed on Belgian television in 1964. But what's sort of hushed up again is that there's a genocide happening at the same time, which is talked about in the film in 1964. And so that's wiped out under the carpet. And for me, it's trying to open up and have that juxtaposition. While jazz is part of that, there's also something else going on. I think specifically with Belgium, because the othering, we haven't talked about this, but the othering for me in Belgium happened out there in the Congo, and it was l'empire du silence, it was silenced. We were not allowed to talk about it, and vice versa. The Congolese were kept stupid. We're not allowed even to study for a university degree. They were kept stupid. That was a fallacy also of the independence, that actually there was not enough schools in Congolese. And it was kept stupid. And I think the articulation about that in Belgium is lagging behind, while the othering in the United States happened within. Even when it comes to an indigenous population, or it comes to sort of the transatlantic passage, that othering made that there was articulation and confrontation sort of within. And so that makes that the articulation happens very different when it comes to when talks about othering in Belgium. It's different now. There's a huge Afro-P community that is part now of the Brussels scene that actually forces to sort of rethink what's going on with our past.
Yeah, in the process of the film coming out and the process of making it, how do you, as the filmmaker now, reflect on the legacy and promise of a political figure like Patrice Lumumba?
I was a learning curve for me. It was sort of knowing, it was similar with Shadow World, the previous film that came out in 2016 about the global arms trade. And I knew, something doesn't add up. And why are a big part of our taxes stolen for, pouring into foreign policy? And, like every country now in Europe has to add to NATO. And maybe that's not the biggest enemy. The enemy is maybe what's going on with Mother Earth, right? And so delving through that subject matter, I came to realize, global arms industry is actually privatized and actually very much dictates foreign policy to a very large degree. If you think that 3 defense lobbyists are actually in number 2 outnumbering politicians, there's 3 defense lobbyists for every politician in Washington. It was the same for Patrice Lumumba. It was a learning curve where I discovered things that I was not in the know of. Like William Burton, for example, he's the president of the MoMA. He was advisor to the Pentagon. He was CEO of Lockheed, had stakes in the mining industry, which was the conglomerate Union Minière, which was implicated in the murder of Patrice Lumumba, who had stakes through Amimex in the Union Minière, which initially was set up by Leopold II. It has a long history, a colonial history. And he's appointed U.S. ambassador to Brussels, and he's actually secretly a CIA agent. This is the president of the MoMA, and reading the cables that actually he literally is advocating with the Belgians to kill Patrice Lumumba. I fell from my chair. We found this audio which has never been released as audio. We found it at the Columbia University, the Department of Diplomatic Studies. But of course, in retrospect, through 60 years, now it's okay to talk about that the president of MoMA was actually calling for assassination. We showed it at the MoMA actually in New York, but it was vetted upstairs. But the learning, for me, also as a kid growing up, this is rooted in ignorance. I think this film was for me also setting myself a challenge, going in dialogue with Nkolo Jombafani, with Conor Cruz O'Brien, with Yves Blouin, trying to come to terms also with Ludo de Witte. Ludo de Witte published The Assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and that that was only end of the it was 1999, that book came out and had all new information where the monarchy was involved and the United Nations was involved. That I did not know myself as well. We hardly learned about Patrice Lumumba except that he was a communist, which he was not. He says, I'm not a communist. In the very beginning of the film says, I'm first of all an African. I'm a sovereign leader who wants to stand on our own feet and make sure that the riches also come back to the population of the country, which is completely valid, right? But learning that actually the monarchy and the United Nations was involved, and there was a follow-up to the book of Ludo de Witte. There was a parliamentary commission, which the conclusion that indeed, the monarchy was implicated. But Ludo de Witte, who was also advisor to the film, said, well, that conclusion is sort of half-baked, right? It's the dialogue is still sort of in the open. They're still discussing in Belgium, is the monarchy is going to say, I'm sorry or not? But this is about reparation, right? They expressed regret, and I have to give it to the king and queen. They went to visit Dennis Mukwege in the Panzi Hospital, but it's a poor band-aid on a much larger situation that is not addressed. And all of these things for me, was an eye-opener talking to Ludo de Witte as well. And Ludo de Witte even advocating that actually the United Nations, don't be too mild because Dag Hammarskjöld was actually implicated. Of course, it's a more difficult situation to describe because Dag Hammarskjöld was with his back against the wall. United States and UK were threatening to withdraw the money from the Congo mission. But learning that even, the United Nations was complicit, that there are arm twisters, that the CIA sends to buy up, this whole, global South movement in the United Nations that gains the majority vote. Suddenly there's a big shift in the United Nations, but arm twisters are sent in to actually reclaim that global South vote in the United Nations. These, for me, things that I fell from my chair when I read that Howard Umbry, who had a building, held a building opposite the United Nations, which was a PR building with a whole army of PR agents, which are all paid for by the CIA. These are things that, and they all fit into the puzzle of how, that sort of what was going on in the Congo at the time with the killing of Patrice Lumumba. There's a larger picture, of course, which is a template that is still similar today when we talk about Gaza or talk about Sudan or talk about Yemen, right? And for me, that was a learning curve. If you say, how do you look at that? It's sort of like, it's not dissimilar with the genocide in Gaza.
My final question for you, Johan, is how has the reception of the film been? It's circulated, it's gone to festivals, and just wondering what you're hearing back from audiences.
Well, what I really like, one is that I had another screening with Congolese sort of activist groups in Brussels. That it's, for example, pirated in the Congo. We had it at the festival, but then it was pirated and it's going around in the Congo. And then it's now, I think it was last week, released in Nairobi in Kenya. And that the grandkids of Lumumba are really in favor of the film. So there's a lot, the Afro-P community in Brussels, because we opened in Vendôme in Matonge, in the Matonge neighborhood in Brussels. And so the Congolese community was very much part of that. Or like we had a screening in the Messel Center in Haarlem, which is very close to the Teresa Hotel. It's precisely that sort of corner where, Malcolm X used to talk, where Michaud had his bookstore. It's now a plaza, but the bookstore is not there anymore. But we had the Congolese community of New York organizing the event together with a Congolese band, and Max Roach's son and daughter were there, and Archie Chep's son was there. And there was a huge discussion, a wonderful sort of debate. But seeing that sort of, that there is an echo that sort of reverbs from, of that community is really wonderful. And another thing that I really like is that the film actually transgresses in not just being an academic film, because I thought maybe the way the film is constructed in the way of its sort of layering and the way it's put together with the music sort of as a protagonist, and then all these academic quotes, it's like a academic PDF as disguised as a music video. I was a bit afraid that actually people would not relate, that it would be too difficult, that part of the language would be too difficult, but actually it's the opposite. It's actually that actually really takes people in, and it actually has been shown a lot. There was also in the Film Forum in New York, there was by popular demand, the film is back in the Film Forum in January. They had to program it 4 weeks, which is unusual. They usually do a week for a documentary, and it was always sold out. But for 4 weeks, they had to extend it. It was sold out for 4 weeks. And they had to bring it back because they didn't have any slots anymore. So I'm very pleased with that. I don't know how it's going to go with the Canadian release. But also in academic circles, there's a huge echo that are surprised to actually see that sort of colonial grab is being sort of criticized in the way it's sort of contextualized by how the Global South gained a majority in the United Nations 15th General Assembly, that was a marker, and that decolonization resolution 1514 that was ratified December 1960 was sort of the flip side of that assassination of Patrice Lumumba. And that comes across and that people relate to it. I'm very happy. I'm really surprised actually that people really, even a younger audience, because like last week, it was a very young audience and the stairs were packed in the cinema. Even had a 5-month run in Brussels, it was still packed. And to see a younger audience really connect to it, that I thought it would be sort of for maybe people that have access to that story. But we did, however, each time sort of confronted also for an in-house audience, including the diaspora and the Afro-P community in our studio in Brussels. And each time sort of, does it work? Is there sort of gaps, or is there here too much being told that we could skip over? And so you could see that actually we were forced to actually extend 1 year working on the editing because we couldn't clear the music rights. And that has helped that actually the film is put together in a sharp way. But yeah, I'm happy that actually people connect to the film.
Johan, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast originally created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. The Below the Radar B-sides are supported by Vancity Credit Union. Thanks for listening to this episode with Johan Grimonprez. Find out more about Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in.